At this point, it's clear that every effort is being made from family and law enforcement to get Nancy home. But there were 4 things that stuck out to the former agent who spoke to me after he watched Savannah's message.
I can break a little news on your program here that I spoke with a detective earlier today, and effective Monday, this investigation will essentially be moved to the task force entirely.
Day 50 in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. 50 days. No arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed break in the case that has been made public. But this week, 2 specific developments landed that are changing the shape and the direction of this investigation in ways that matter and that the public needs to understand fully. First, the Guthrie family broke weeks of silence with a new written statement, and for the very first time in 50 days, they pointed directly and specifically at the Tucson community. Their words were deliberate and they were chosen carefully. Someone local holds the key to finding resolution in this case. That is not a general appeal for tips. That is a targeted message aimed at a specific audience, and it was approved by the FBI before a single word of it was released publicly. Second, a former detective and state trooper with decades of behavioral analysis experience sat down with one of the most credible investigative reporters covering this case and publicly named a likely direction. The abductor fled after taking Nancy and identified where their base of operations probably is located. South Tucson, a specific area, a specific direction, named publicly for the first time by someone with the professional credentials to make that assessment credibly. At the same time, the FBI is actively investigating a vacant house that sits adjacent to Nancy's property as a possible staging location used in the weeks and months before the abduction. A neighbor who moved out of that street before Nancy disappeared has reportedly been seen returning to the neighborhood after her disappearance. And every single date that investigators have flagged as significant in this entire investigation, January 11th, January 24th, and February 1st, every single one of those dates falls on a weekend. Not a Tuesday, not a Thursday morning, weekends, every time. The question that investigators are now asking more directly than at any previous point in this investigation is whether the person who took Nancy Guthrie is someone who works a regular structured job in Tucson during the week and has been using their weekends to conduct surveillance, case the neighborhood, plan the operation, and eventually execute a plan that was months in the making. That because the accumulating evidence is pointing in that direction more clearly with each passing week. And if that is what the evidence is saying, then the person who took her may have driven past the memorial that has grown outside her home, may have watched the news coverage from a television in a house a few miles away, may be going to work on Monday morning in this city and coming home on Friday evening to a life that looks completely ordinary to everyone around them. Let's go through every piece of this carefully because each thread connects to the others in ways that the fragmented coverage of this case has not fully laid out. Day 50 and the Guthrie family finally broke their silence. Not through an emotional Instagram video, not through a press conference. Through a carefully constructed written statement that was released to Tucson's local NBC affiliate, KVOA. And in an active federal kidnapping investigation at this stage of the case, statements like this one do not simply express grief. They carry messages. Every single word in a statement like this is deliberate. Every phrase has been reviewed. Nothing gets through without federal sign-off. When the Guthrie family puts words on paper at day 50 of an active FBI investigation, those words are operational. They mean something specific to a specific audience. Brian Enton is News Nation's senior investigative reporter, and he has been on the ground in Tucson since nearly the first days of this investigation. He analyzed every word of that statement publicly and was direct about what it means and how it was constructed. This statement, he said, nothing in it is accidental. And the words that stopped every investigative reporter and every law enforcement analyst covering this case were these. We continue to believe it is Tucsonans and the greater southern Arizona community that hold the key to finding resolution in this case. Tucsonans. That is a specific word, not a stranger passing through on an interstate. Not someone from another state who targeted this neighborhood from a distance. Tucsonans, people who live in that city, people who know those streets from regular daily experience, people who could have driven past Nancy Guthrie's house on a routine basis without anyone questioning their presence because they belong in that geography. They are part of the visual landscape of that neighborhood. They are not anomalies. They are regulars. Enton said he has been hearing this from law enforcement sources repeatedly since the early days of this investigation. The belief that exists inside the Joint Task Force is that whoever did this is local, is from the Tucson area, and could potentially be from that specific neighborhood or the immediately surrounding streets. This belief has been a quiet but persistent current running through the investigative thinking from the beginning. For the first time at day 50, the family is now saying it publicly in a statement that has the FBI's fingerprints all over its language and construction. That is not a routine update. That is a deliberate public signal sent to a deliberate audience. The statement also named something that had never been mentioned publicly by the family before: the late evening of January 11th. So, not just the date January 11th, which has come up in investigative discussions before. The late evening of January 11th specifically, a time of day. Enton's sources are telling him that the doorbell camera photographs showing the suspect without a backpack, which are visually distinct from the February 1st images where he arrives fully equipped and mission ready, may be from January 11th. This matters because it places the first confirmed visit to that property on a specific evening 3 weeks before the abduction and begins to build a documented timeline of surveillance that stretches back further than most public coverage has acknowledged. 4 independent networks have reported this. ABC, NBC, Fox, and News Nation all reported based on 4 separate independent law enforcement sources that the surveillance photographs captured on the doorbell camera come from different dates and represent different visits. The sheriff has pushed back on that interpretation publicly and repeatedly. But Enton's sources inside the investigation are holding firm on that reporting. Now look at the dates that investigators have flagged and look at them with the specific attention they deserve, because this pattern has been sitting in plain sight throughout this investigation and has not received the analytical attention it warrants. January 11th falls on a Sunday. January 24th falls on a Saturday. February 1st, the night Nancy was taken, begins in the early morning hours of a Sunday. Every single date the FBI has identified as significant in this case, every confirmed or probable visit to that property, every flag date on the investigative timeline falls on a weekend. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns in criminal behavior are not random. They reflect the constraints and the structure of the person's regular life. This pattern points unmistakably to someone with a structured weekday life. Someone who works or attends school or has some form of regular obligation that runs Monday through Friday and gives them Saturdays and Sundays to operate. Someone local enough to this neighborhood that a weekend trip there does not require hours of travel or overnight logistics. Someone who can drive to the Catalina Foothills on a Saturday evening, walk past a house, assess the conditions, decide the timing is not right, and drive back home without it costing them anything significant. Someone who can come back the following weekend and the weekend after that until the conditions are exactly what they need them to be. That behavioral profile is not a drifter. It is not a transient. It is not someone who traveled from another state to commit this crime. It is a person embedded in the daily rhythm of Tucson, someone with roots in this city, someone for whom that neighborhood is familiar geography, part of their regular world. Now to the development that generated the most significant new analytical framework this week. Former detective and state trooper Morgan Wright sat down with Brian Enton and described Nancy Guthrie's abductor using a specific term that comes directly from criminal behavioral analysis: a marauder. This is not casual language. So in behavioral profiling, a marauder is a defined category of offender with specific and documented characteristics. A marauder operates from a fixed home base. They range out from that base to commit the offense, and then they return to it. They are not traveling from another city. They are not strangers passing through a region they do not know. They live close enough to their target to come and go with relative ease. Close enough to abort a plan if something interrupts it and return the following weekend without significant cost or logistical difficulty. Close enough to observe from a distance over an extended period and develop the detailed operational knowledge of the target's routines and vulnerabilities that this crime clearly required. And Wright did not stop at the behavioral category. He named a direction. Based on the way the suspect was dressed that night, his apparent need to move quickly after the abduction was completed, and the specific geography of the Catalina Foothills area, Wright assessed that the abductor's base of operations was likely towards South Tucson. The mountains to the north make that direction logistically impractical for someone trying to move fast and return to familiar ground quickly. The accessible routes, the geography that makes sense for someone trying to exit the area without using major surveillance-heavy corridors, point south. South Tucson is where Wright's decades of behavioral analysis experience is pointing. A former detective and state trooper with the professional credentials to make this assessment is giving this investigation a geographic target that is as specific as anything that has been said publicly about the location of this suspect. That deserves to be taken seriously. Now, layer that geographic assessment on top of what the FBI has confirmed is actively being investigated in the immediate neighborhood around Nancy's property. A vacant house adjacent to her home is being actively examined as a potential staging location. Retired Pima County SWAT Commander Bob Kyrie spoke to Parade magazine about this, and his assessment was specific and detailed. A vacant property in that location could have served as a home base or staging location for someone conducting extended pre-abduction surveillance. As it provides a cover story for being in that neighborhood at varying hours across multiple weeks. It gives a physical location from which to observe Nancy's daily patterns, her comings and goings, her schedule. Which nights her lights went out early, which nights her driveway was empty, which nights she was completely and verifiably alone inside that house. Kyrie went further than that. A vacant property like that, he said, could also be used to set up concealed surveillance equipment inside the structure itself, positioned to monitor activity on the street or at adjacent properties without any visible footprint on the street that would attract attention. Think about what that means in practical terms. Someone with access to a vacant house next door to Nancy's property could have spent weeks or months building an extraordinarily detailed picture of her daily life from a position that was physically a few feet away with zero visible presence on that street. No car idling at the curb, no figure standing in a yard. Just a dark house that nobody thought twice about because vacant houses in residential neighborhoods do not attract attention. And then there is the neighbor detail that Brian Enton confirmed this week. The FBI is asking specific questions about a neighbor who moved out of that street before Nancy disappeared and was subsequently seen returning to the neighborhood after her disappearance. Not moving away and establishing a new life elsewhere. Moving away and coming back. Said the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed to Fox News Digital on March 20th that detectives are actively evaluating reports of suspicious activity connected to that recently vacant property. And Nancy's neighbor of 30 years, Aldine Meister, provided the most direct account of how this came to investigators' attention. She told them specifically and on record, "The neighbors on the other side of me moved out. I wanted them to check that house. The FBI heard her. And they went back to that property." Now let's build the full picture of what the confirmed evidence tells us about the sequence of visits to Nancy's property before February 1st, because this sequence is the operational backbone of the entire case. The doorbell camera photographs confirmed by 4 independent networks drawing on 4 separate law enforcement sources show the suspect on at least 2 distinct visits to the property on different dates. The first visit presents a very different profile from the second. No backpack. The suspect studying the camera position, assessing the entrance, and apparently deciding conditions are not right before leaving. No confrontation, no entry, just observation and withdrawal. The second visit is a completely transformed operational picture. Mask properly fitted, firearm holstered, backpack fully loaded with whatever equipment he brought that required 41 minutes to use inside that house. A plan that had been thought through, rehearsed mentally, and was now being executed. 2 visits. 2 completely different profiles. The gap between the first visit and the second visit is the time this person spent going home, sitting with what they observed, acquiring or organizing what they needed, and deciding when to come back. Someone who can abort on the first attempt and return on a later date is someone who does not have far to travel. Someone for whom that neighborhood is not a destination that required planning and logistics to reach. It is part of their accessible geography. It is a place they can reach on a weekend evening and return from without it being a significant undertaking. That is local. That is someone for whom the Catalina Foothills area is familiar ground. Now to the construction angle, because this is a thread the FBI is currently pulling with a level of specificity that tells you exactly how seriously they are taking it. The FBI is requesting the name of every single contractor and every single worker on multiple construction sites in the neighborhood surrounding Nancy's property. Not general inquiries about companies, not broad requests for project records. Specific names. Every individual person who had a presence on those sites during the relevant window. Former FBI agent Steve Moore addressed this directly, and his reasoning is worth understanding in full. The theory that has driven significant investigative thinking from the beginning is that this crime was targeted and that someone with daily legal unremarkable access to that specific street during January had something that is almost impossible to create from a distance or manufacture quickly. Think carefully about what daily construction access to a residential neighborhood actually provides to someone with a surveillance objective. You arrive every morning in a work truck with tools. You are expected to be there. Neighbors see you regularly enough that you become part of the visual background of the street. Nobody calls law enforcement about a work crew. Nobody approaches a person in work clothes and a hard hat and demands to know what they are doing there. You can stand on that block and observe which car is in which driveway. You can time how long it takes a specific resident to walk from their garage to their front door. You can identify where the security cameras are mounted, whether they appear to be actively recording or are simply installed without monitoring. You can note over days and weeks of daily presence which houses have dogs, which houses have visitors on certain evenings, which houses go dark early on weeknights, and which houses show activity late into the evening. Over weeks of daily legal presence on that street, someone with a surveillance objective could accumulate the kind of detailed operational knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's life and routines that this crime clearly required. And that person does not even need to be the individual who put on the mask on the night of February 1st. They simply need to have been in a position to observe and then to pass what they observed to someone who used it. The FBI wants every name from those construction sites. That is not a casual investigative request. That is a targeted search for a specific category of potential witness or a potential person of interest. Now to one more element that was raised this week by forensic behavioral expert Brant Smith, and that deserves serious attention in the context of everything else we know about this case. In cases of this type, Smith told Fox News Digital, suspects frequently return to the crime scene after the fact, and she was specific about what that behavior actually looks like in documented cases. This is the type of person, she said, who could come back to the memorial that has grown outside Nancy's home, who could stand among the people leaving flowers and candles, who could take photographs of the tribute, who could watch the vigils from within the crowd of mourners, and who could observe the news coverage and the public response from a position of apparent normalcy among the people who are grieving. Brian Enton stated this directly and on the record on his broadcast. It is possible, he said, that the suspect has already been seen in footage filmed outside Nancy's house during public events. This is documented behavior in other high-profile cases. It is not speculative. It is a known behavioral pattern in this category of offender. Investigators have been watching every person who has visited that memorial. Every single person. Now to the DNA, because this is where the case ultimately resolves and the local angle adds critical dimensions to the DNA picture that have not been fully explained in the public coverage of this investigation. Foreign DNA was recovered from inside Nancy's home. A genetic material not connected to her and not connected to anyone with regular authorized access to that property. A complex mixed profile with more than one contributor that is currently being processed at a private laboratory in Florida. Forensic genetic genealogy has been formally initiated on that sample. This is the same methodology that identified Brian Kohberger in the University of Idaho murders. It is the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, after more than 4 decades of investigation. The methodology works by taking an unknown DNA profile and building a family tree outward from partial matches with relatives who have voluntarily submitted their genetic material to consumer platforms like GED Match or 23andMe or Ancestry. Said it does not require the suspect's DNA to already exist in any law enforcement database. It requires one connection, one distant cousin, one family member anywhere in the country who shared their genetics with a genealogy service. And from that single connection, the tree builds outward and inward simultaneously until it narrows to a name. Brian Enton has said directly and with conviction that he believes DNA is what ultimately cracks this case open. Forensics expert April Stonehouse confirmed that the processing of the available samples has been moving rapidly. Retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffin-Daffer told Newsweek that the case is red hot behind the scenes with more active investigative leads than most comparable cases ever generate at this stage. Now here is what the local angle specifically adds to the DNA picture and why it matters beyond what the general coverage has explained. If the abductor is from Tucson, if their base of operations is somewhere in or around South Tucson, as the behavioral analysis suggests, if they worked on a construction site in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood during January, or if they spent time inside that vacant house adjacent to Nancy's property during the surveillance period, then their DNA is not only potentially present inside her home on the night of the abduction. Their genetic material may be present on surfaces touched during the weeks of surveillance visits that preceded February 1st. a gate latch, a utility box that was vandalized near her property and that investigators have already flagged as part of the investigation, a doorstep. Savannah surfaced casually contacted during reconnaissance visits that happened weeks before anyone was looking for forensic evidence. Every name the FBI is collecting from those construction site rosters is a potential DNA comparison point. Every former resident of that street is a potential match candidate. Every worker who moved through that neighborhood during January and whose identity can be established is a person whose genetic profile can be compared against what is sitting in that Florida laboratory right now. And genetic genealogy does not wait for the suspect to have a prior criminal record. It does not depend on them ever having been arrested or processed in any law enforcement system. It needs one relative, one distant family member who shared their DNA with a consumer service at any point. And in 2026, with the genealogy database populations that currently exist, the probability that any individual in the United States has 0 relatives who have ever submitted a sample to any consumer platform approaches 0. The tree will build. The question is only how long it takes. This week, the sheriff said something in a local Tucson radio interview that was notably more candid and less guarded than anything he has said in any of his national media appearances. He said, and the phrasing is worth noting exactly. Yes, I know a lot, but I am not going to share that with the public. It is about protecting the integrity of the investigation. He knows something. The FBI knows something. Oh, and the DNA processing that is running right now in that private laboratory in Florida may be the mechanism that finally converts what they know from investigative intelligence into courtroom-ready evidence that can support a prosecution. Now, there is one section of the Guthrie family statement released this week that did not make the headlines of most coverage, but that is arguably the most significant thing the family has said publicly in 50 days, and it needs to be heard in full and understood for what it is actually saying. The family wrote that they want to celebrate Nancy's beautiful and courageous life, but that they cannot do that until she is brought to a final place of rest. Read that phrase again carefully. A final place of rest. Not until she comes home. See, not until she walks back through the door of the house she has lived in for 50 years. A final place of rest. That is a family that has been living with the full weight of what the evidence and the passage of time are telling them. That is a family that loves their mother completely and is also beginning to prepare, gently and with evident heartbreak, for every possibility that 50 days without proof of life may represent. And then they wrote this: "We cannot grieve. We can only ache and wonder." Those words were approved by the FBI. Those words were chosen deliberately. And those words describe exactly what it looks like to be 50 days into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman who requires daily cardiac medication, who has a pacemaker that went silent on the night of February 1st, and from whom no credible proof of life has emerged in nearly 2 months. 50 days. A family that has done everything right throughout all of it. Savannah breaking down on Instagram in videos that were painful to watch. Annie weeping audibly at the memorial outside her mother's home. Cameron speaking directly on camera to whoever took their mother. A family that cooperated fully with every investigative request, that offered $1 million reward, that stood in front of every camera available to them, that held on publicly through everything. And now, in a carefully crafted statement approved by the FBI, they are beginning, gently and with evident courage, to hold open space for every possible truth about where their mother is. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in that community for 50 years. And she had dinner with her family on a Saturday evening, played card games, laughed, and trusted the world around her completely. She deserved to go home safely that night. She deserves to come home now. And somebody in Tucson knows what happened during those 41 minutes. Somebody who works a regular job in this city during the week. Somebody who knows those streets from personal daily experience. Somebody who may have stood on that specific street and watched that specific house from the outside across multiple weekends in January. Somebody who knows exactly where they went after they left that neighborhood in the early morning hours of February 1st and exactly what they did when they got there. The Guthrie family pointed directly at the Tucson community in a statement the FBI approved word by word. A former detective with decades of behavioral analysis experience named South Tucson as the likely base of operations. A vacant house immediately adjacent to Nancy's property is being investigated as a staging location for extended pre-abduction surveillance. A neighbor who moved out of that street kept coming back after the disappearance. Every date, investigators have flagged falls on a weekend. The DNA is in active processing in a Florida laboratory. Forensic genetic genealogy has been initiated. And the sheriff said publicly this week that he knows things he cannot yet share. This case is not cold. It is not stalled. It is not running out of threads to pull. It is narrowing. Methodically and deliberately toward one geographic area, one neighborhood, as one person who has been sustaining the ordinary appearance of a normal daily life in a city they call home, while carrying the full weight of what they did on the night of February 1st. If you are in Tucson tonight and you know someone whose behavior changed in the days or weeks around February 1st, if you noticed a vehicle on your street on January 11th or January 24th that had no obvious reason to be there, if you worked construction in the Catalina Foothills area during January or early February and saw something during those weeks that did not sit right with you at the time, if you know someone who suddenly seemed different after the news of Nancy's disappearance broke, make the call tonight. Contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324. You can submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov or contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department directly at 5203-5149. Everything is completely anonymous. The reward is over $1 million. No ID required. Cash at a neutral location. Sometimes the right person sees the right story at exactly the right moment. And that one person could be the thing that brings Nancy home. 50 days, one family still waiting, one city that holds the answer, and an investigation that is closer tonight than it has ever been to the name at the end of that genealogy tree. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home,